Welcome, dear traveler. Find yourself somewhere comfortable tonight, somewhere you can truly settle in and let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders like sand slipping through an hourglass. Perhaps you're nestled beneath soft blankets, or maybe you're watching the last light fade from your window. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. But before we begin our journey together, I'd love it if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if this is truly where you want to be, only if these stories bring you something meaningful. And down in the comments, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time the clock shows where you are. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all scattered across time zones, yet gathered here together in this quiet moment. Now dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle, constant hum that helps the world fade away. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders drop. And let's ease into tonight's hazy, ancient journey together. Tonight, we begin not with emperors or warriors, not with kingdoms or conquests, but with something far simpler and far stranger. A plant. An unassuming green companion to humanity that has confused healers, inspired mystics, frustrated governments, and somehow managed to survive 5,000 years of human civilization trying to figure out exactly what to do with it. This is the story of cannabis, a plant that's been rope and ritual, medicine and mystery, sacrament and scandal all at once. We're traveling back now, back beyond recorded history, beyond the first cities and the first kings, all the way to roughly 5,000 years before the Common Era. The Stone Age, when civilization itself was still finding its footing, still in what we might call beta testing. Humanity was just beginning to settle down, inventing pottery with shaking hands, domesticating animals through trial and error, and dying from things as simple as infected cuts or standing too close to a mosquito at the wrong time. Picture, if you will, somewhere in what we now call Siberia, in the endless cold and the eternal silence of the steppe. A forager, their hands rough from work, their face weathered by wind, tosses dried plant material onto a campfire for warmth. They lean in close, seeking heat against the bitter cold, and take a deep breath of the rising smoke. And then something unexpected happens. The world softens at the edges. Time stretches and bends. They forget, just for a moment, why they stepped outside in the first place. The stars seem closer. The fire seemed wiser. And nothing will ever be quite the same. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would uncover burial sites across Central Asia, and there, tucked carefully beside the bones of the dead, they would find cannabis seeds, cannabis flowers, entire cannabis plants laid out like offerings. Someone, in those distant ages, valued this plant enough to send it into the afterlife with them. Either it was profoundly sacred, a key to unlock the mysteries beyond death, or it was the prehistoric equivalent of "don't you dare bury me without my stash." Knowing human nature as we do, it was probably both. At first, cannabis wasn't about transcendence or philosophy or sitting around pondering the nature of existence. It was about something much more practical: survival. Those tough, fibrous stalks could be stripped and woven into rope strong enough to bind, into fabric durable enough to wear against the elements. The seeds were packed with nutrition, edible and nourishing in times when food was never guaranteed. This plant was nature's Swiss Army knife, a tool for every occasion. You could sail with it, tie your shelter together with it, clothe yourself in it, eat it when you were hungry. And if you accidentally smoked it while sitting too close to the fire, well, suddenly the clouds overhead seemed remarkably hilarious, and the patterns in the flames held secrets you'd never noticed before. Try to imagine being one of the very first humans to inhale that smoke intentionally, to draw it deep into your lungs and feel reality shift beneath your feet. There's no one there to explain what's happening to you. No guidebook, no experienced friend to say, "Don't worry, this is normal, you're just high." No carefully curated music, no comfortable couch, no snacks waiting in the next room. Just you, the smoke, the fire, and raw, unfiltered confusion as your consciousness expands into territories it's never visited before. You might find yourself having a deep, meaningful conversation with a tree that stubbornly refuses to talk back. You might stare at your own hands as if seeing them for the first time, marveling at the miracle of fingers. Those early humans probably didn't have a word for getting high. They didn't think, "Oh, I'm experiencing altered consciousness due to psychoactive compounds." They might have thought they were communing with spirits, or that the smoke carried messages from the gods, or that they'd accidentally stepped sideways into the world of dreams while still awake. And perhaps, in their own way, they were right. So let yourself sink deeper now into your pillows, into your blankets, into this story. Let the ancient smoke carry you backward through time, to a world stranger and simpler than ours, where a plant was just beginning its long, complicated relationship with humanity. A relationship that would span continents and millennia, that would shape medicine and religion, politics and poetry, that continues even now, tonight, as you drift towards sleep on the echoes of those first, accidental discoveries made around Stone Age fires, under Stone Age stars, by people who were, in the end, not so different from us. Are you ready? Then let us begin 5,000 years ago, when the grass stretched endlessly toward distant horizons, and humanity first discovered a plant that would change the world. Imagine, if you will, the Central Asian steppes as they appeared thousands of years before the modern world took shape. This vast grassland, stretching from what we now call Mongolia through southern Siberia and down into the Hindu Kush mountains, was a place of extraordinary beauty and harsh survival. The sky here was larger than anywhere else on Earth, an endless dome of blue by day and a riot of stars by night. The grass itself grew in waves, rippling in the constant wind like the surface of a green ocean. And among these grasses grew a plant with distinctive serrated leaves and a pungent aroma that animals learned to recognize and humans came to revere. This was cannabis sativa, and it may well be one of the oldest cultivated crops in human history, a companion to our species for at least 12,000 years. Think about that for a moment. 12,000 years. Before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the first cities rose from the Mesopotamian plains, our ancestors were already familiar with this plant. They knew its fibers could be woven into ropes strong enough to bind, into fabric durable enough to wear. They knew its seeds were nutritious, rich with oils and proteins. And they knew, whether through accident or intention, that certain parts of the plant, when burned or consumed, could alter consciousness, could lift the veil between the mundane world and something larger, something numinous and strange. The earliest archaeological evidence of cannabis use comes from burial sites in ancient settlements scattered across East Asia. In the remains of Neolithic villages, archaeologists have found hemp fibers impressed into pottery dating back to the 5th millennium before the Common Era. They've discovered cannabis seeds carefully stored in ceramic vessels, suggesting that people valued these seeds highly enough to preserve them with care. They've uncovered the charred remains of cannabis flowers in ancient braziers, the residue of smoke that rose into the air 5,000 years ago and has long since dissipated, leaving only the faintest chemical trace for modern scientists to puzzle over. But cannabis wasn't content to remain in its original homeland. As human populations migrated, as trade routes formed, as empires rose and fell and rose again, cannabis traveled with them. The plant was remarkably adaptable, able to thrive in diverse climates and soil conditions. More importantly, it was remarkably useful. Every part of the plant had value. The tough, fibrous stalks could be processed into hemp for textiles, ropes, and paper. The seeds could be eaten or pressed for oil. The flowers and leaves, particularly of the female plants, contained compounds that could soothe pain, induce sleep, stimulate appetite, and produce visions. In these ancient times, the boundaries we now draw between medicine, recreation, and spirituality didn't really exist. A plant that could heal was often a plant that could transport you to other realms of consciousness, and a plant that could do both was inherently sacred. Cannabis occupied this triple role in many early cultures. It was practical and mystical, mundane and magical, all at once. Picture a summer evening on the steppes, perhaps 4,000 years ago. The sun is setting in a blaze of orange and crimson, and a small group of people has gathered around a fire. They're preparing for a ritual, perhaps a funeral for a beloved elder, perhaps a celebration of the summer solstice, perhaps a healing ceremony for someone who is ill. One of them carefully places dried cannabis flowers on heated stones arranged in a small pit. As the plant material makes contact with the hot rock, it begins to smolder and smoke, releasing a thick aromatic vapor into the air. The people leaning close, breathing deeply, pulling the smoke into their lungs. Their eyes begin to soften, their breathing slows, their rigid boundaries of self begin to blur and dissolve. The elder they're honoring seems closer somehow, not gone but transformed, present in the smoke, in the scent, in the stars emerging overhead. Or perhaps they feel their own pain receding, the chronic ache in their joints fading to a manageable whisper. Or maybe they simply feel a profound sense of peace, a connection to something larger than themselves, a glimpse of the infinite that makes their small lives feel both precious and insignificant all at once. This is how cannabis wove itself into the fabric of human culture. Not through conquest or imposition, but through utility and wonder, through its ability to serve multiple needs simultaneously, through its capacity to open doors in consciousness that people didn't even know existed until they walked through them. And as we'll see, this pattern would repeat across millennia and continents. Wherever cannabis went, it became part of the local medicine, part of the local spirituality, part of the local economy. It was cultivated in the gardens of emperors and the fields of peasants. It was burned in the temples of priests and the tents of nomadic warriors. It was traded along the Silk Road and carried on ships crossing distant seas. 5,000 years of human history, and cannabis was there for almost all of it, a green thread running through the grand narrative of civilization. But to understand how cannabis spread across the ancient world, we need to meet some of the people who carried it. We need to travel to ancient China to meet a legendary emperor who tasted every plant that grew from the earth. We need to ride with fierce warriors across the steppes, learning their rituals and their secrets. We need to walk through gardens in India, climb mountains in Persia, and stand in the courts of medieval Arabia. Let us begin in China, in the myths of prehistory, with a figure who may or may not have existed but whose legend has shaped the understanding of medicine for thousands of years. Let us meet the divine farmer, the emperor who communed with plants and paid the ultimate price for his curiosity. Breathe slowly now and let yourself slip backward through time, past the centuries, past the millennia, until you find yourself in ancient China, in an age so distant that history and myth blend together like watercolors running on wet paper. The China we're visiting exists more in legend than in documented fact. A China of divine emperors and magical events, of gods who walked the earth teaching humans how to survive and thrive. Here we meet Shennong, whose name means divine farmer, or divine husbandman. He is described in ancient texts as one of the three sovereigns, the mythical god kings who ruled China in the age before recorded history. Some stories say he was born from the womb of a princess who was impregnated by a divine dragon. Others claim he emerged fully formed from the earth itself. Many depictions show him as a strange hybrid being, a man's body with the head of a bull, with bronze-colored skin and iron bones, a creature both human and divine. According to legend, Shennong lived around 2,800 or 2,700 years before the Common Era, though scholars today understand that these dates are almost certainly mythical, attached to a legendary figure long after the fact. But whether Shennong was a real person, a composite of several historical figures, or a purely mythological creation doesn't really matter for our purposes tonight. What matters is the story, the legend that has inspired Chinese medicine and herbalism for thousands of years. Shennong is credited with teaching the ancient Chinese people the fundamental practices of agriculture. He invented the plow, the axe, the irrigation system. He showed people how to prepare and store seeds, how to recognize the changing seasons and plant accordingly. He established the first farmers' markets, creating a system where people could trade their surplus crops and goods. In many ways, he transformed the Chinese people from wandering hunter-gatherers into settled agricultural communities. But his greatest gift, according to legend, was his knowledge of medicinal plants. The story says that Shennong possessed a magical transparent stomach, so that he could observe what happened inside his body when he consumed different plants. Some versions of the tale claim his entire body was translucent, like glass, so that he could watch the effects of each herb as it traveled through his system, coloring his organs, speeding or slowing his heartbeat, bringing warmth or coolness, clarity or confusion. Driven by a profound dedication to helping humanity, Shennong set himself an extraordinary task. He would personally taste every plant that grew from the earth, discovering which ones were food, which were medicine, and which were poison. Imagine the courage this required. Every day he would venture into the wilderness, find a plant he hadn't yet tested, and consume it, watching carefully to see what happened to his body, what sensations arose, what changes occurred. The legend says he tested hundreds of plants, perhaps as many as 365, one for each day of the year. He experienced the effects of every herb, every root, every leaf, every flower. Some plants nourished him, filling his belly with warmth and energy. Some plants healed him, soothing aches and pains, clearing fevers, strengthening his qi. Some plants altered his consciousness, opening portals to spiritual realms, allowing him to commune with gods and ancestors. And some plants, of course, were deadly. The story of Shennong's death is particularly poignant. After years of testing plants, after surviving countless poisonings through his knowledge and divine constitution, he finally encountered a plant whose toxicity was simply too powerful. One version says it was a yellow flower with multi-petaled blooms. Another suggests it was a toxic herb that caused his intestines to rupture before he could consume an antidote. As he felt the poison overwhelming his system, he tried desperately to reach for the herbs that could save him, but his strength failed. The divine farmer, who had given humanity the gift of herbal knowledge, died from the very curiosity that drove him to help others. But before his death, Shennong compiled his findings into a great herbal text. This work, known as the Pen Tsao or the Shennong Benchao Jing, which translates beautifully as the Divine Farmer's Herb Root Classic, or the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica, would become one of the foundational texts of Chinese medicine. Though the original manuscript has long been lost, copies and commentaries have preserved its wisdom for thousands of years. And among the 365 herbs documented in this classic text, cannabis holds a special place. The plant, called ma in Chinese, is classified as a superior herb, one of the highest categories in the Chinese medicinal system. Superior herbs were considered safe for long-term use, capable of prolonging life and promoting general health rather than simply treating specific diseases. The text describes cannabis as useful for treating a remarkable range of conditions. It was prescribed for rheumatism, that chronic aching in the joints that afflicted so many people who worked hard physical labor. It was recommended for gout, for malaria, for menstrual problems, for constipation. Interestingly, it was even suggested as a treatment for absent-mindedness and memory problems, though whether this refers to cannabis flowers or simply the nutritious seeds remains a matter of scholarly debate. Later Chinese physicians expanded on Shennong's original findings. Around the 2nd century of the Common Era, a surgeon named Hua Tua began using cannabis in a truly revolutionary way. He discovered that when cannabis was reduced to a powder and mixed with wine, it could serve as an anesthetic for surgical procedures. Imagine that, in an age long before modern medicine, a doctor in ancient China was performing organ transplants, intestinal resections, and chest surgeries, with his patients rendered unconscious by cannabis wine. The Chinese word for anesthesia, mazui, literally translates to cannabis intoxication, a linguistic fossil preserving the memory of these early medical innovations. But cannabis in ancient China wasn't only medicine. It was also deeply woven into the spiritual and ritual life of the people. Archaeological excavations have uncovered tomb after tomb containing cannabis seeds, cannabis flowers, and cannabis residue. In the Turpan Basin of western China, archaeologists discovered a burial site dating back approximately 2,500 years, containing the body of a man with distinctly Caucasian features, buried with 13 complete cannabis plants laid diagonally across his chest like a green shroud. This wasn't an isolated case. Tomb after tomb, dating back thousands of years, contained cannabis in some form. Sometimes just seeds, carefully placed in ceramic vessels. Sometimes flowering tops, the psychoactive part of the female plant. Sometimes the residue of burned cannabis in bronze braziers. The pattern is clear. People valued cannabis enough to include it in burials, to send it with the dead into whatever afterlife awaited them. Why? We can only speculate, but the evidence suggests multiple reasons. Some of these individuals may have used cannabis medicinally in life, to treat chronic pain or illness, and their loved ones wanted to ensure they had access to their medicine in death. Some may have valued it spiritually, as a substance that allowed a communion with the divine, that could help the deceased navigate the dangerous journey to the afterlife. Some may have simply recognized it as valuable, as a form of wealth worth preserving beyond death. What we do know is that by the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, cannabis was so thoroughly integrated into Chinese culture that it appeared in poetry, in medical texts, in agricultural manuals, and in religious ceremonies. The plant's fibers were woven into the finest fabrics, worn by nobles and commoners alike. Its seeds were pressed for oil used for cooking and lamp fuel. Its flowers were burned as incense in temples, consumed as medicine in physicians' halls, and quite possibly enjoyed recreationally, though the historical record is somewhat coy about this aspect. The Chinese understanding of cannabis, documented in texts attributed to the divine farmer, would eventually spread along trade routes, influencing medical practices throughout Asia. But cannabis didn't need ancient medical texts to spread. It had other carriers, other champions, other stories to tell. And some of the most remarkable of these stories involve fierce nomadic warriors who would spread cannabis use across an entire continent through their conquests and their rituals. Let your breathing deepen now. Feel yourself drifting, floating on these ancient stories like a leaf on a gentle stream. We're about to meet the Scythians, the horsemen of the steppes, the warriors who terrified civilized peoples from Greece to China, who built no cities but left behind golden treasures and the residue of sacred smoke. Picture yourself now on the vast Eurasian steppes, that enormous grassland stretching from the Black Sea in the west to Mongolia in the east, a landscape so immense that it seems to curve away into infinity in every direction. The grass here grows waist-high in summer, rippling in waves when the wind blows, and the sky overhead is so huge and empty that it feels like you could fall upward into it and tumble through the blue forever. This is the homeland of the Scythians, a nomadic people who dominated these grasslands for roughly 1,000 years, from around 800 before the Common Era to roughly 300. They built no permanent cities, kept no written records in their own language, and left behind almost nothing except their burial mounds and the accounts of their enemies and trading partners. Yet they were one of the most formidable military powers of their age, feared by the Persian Empire, respected by the Greeks, known to the Chinese as fierce and unpredictable neighbors. The Scythians were master horsemen, perhaps the finest horse riders the ancient world ever produced. They learned to ride before they could properly walk, growing up in the saddle, developing such profound unity with their mounts that Greek observers thought they might be a single creature, giving birth to the myth of the centaur, half human and half horse. They were also master archers, capable of shooting accurately from horseback at full gallop, raining arrows down on their enemies before those enemies could even get close enough to fight back. But the Scythians weren't simply warriors. They were also deeply spiritual people, with elaborate religious rituals and a profound respect for the sacred. And central to many of their rituals was a plant that grew wild across their steppe homelands: cannabis. We know about Scythian cannabis use primarily from one source, the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about them in the 5th century before the Common Era. Herodotus had a reputation for recording both fact and fantasy with equal enthusiasm, leading later historians to nickname him both the father of history and the father of lies. But in the case of the Scythians and cannabis, archaeology has vindicated him remarkably well. Herodotus describes a Scythian purification ritual that took place after the burial of a king or important leader. The Scythians, he writes, would erect small tent-like structures by fixing 3 wooden poles in the ground, leaning them together at the top, and stretching woolen felts around them to create an enclosed space. Inside this tent, they would place a dish on the ground and fill it with red-hot stones. Then they would take hemp seed, as Herodotus calls it, and creep under the felt coverings and throw the seeds onto the hot stones. Immediately it smokes, Herodotus writes, and gives out such a vapor as no Grecian vapor bath can exceed. The Scythians, delighted, shout for joy, and this vapor serves them instead of a water bath, for they never by any chance wash their bodies with water. For centuries, scholars assumed Herodotus was either exaggerating or simply making this up. The idea of ancient warriors sitting in tents, inhaling cannabis vapor until they shouted with joy seemed too strange, too specific, too modern somehow. But then, in 1929, archaeologists working in the Pazyryk region of the Altai Mountains, along the border between Siberia and Kazakhstan, made an extraordinary discovery. They found a series of burial mounds called kurgans, dating to the 5th through 3rd centuries before the Common Era. These weren't simple graves. They were elaborate underground chambers, some containing embalmed bodies decorated with intricate tattoos, others holding sacrificed horses with ornate saddles and bridles, all of them filled with the treasures deemed necessary for the afterlife. And among these treasures, the archaeologists found exactly what Herodotus had described: wooden tent frames about 4 feet tall, of exactly the size and structure he mentioned, bronze vessels that could be filled with hot stones, leather bags containing fossilized cannabis seeds, traces of burnt cannabis residue in the vessels. Everything needed to create the vapor bath Herodotus had written about, preserved for 2,500 years in the frozen Siberian earth. But the discoveries didn't stop there. In 2013, archaeologists excavating a Scythian kurgan near Stavropol in southern Russia uncovered something even more spectacular. Deep beneath a layer of protective clay, they found a secret chamber that grave robbers had somehow missed. Inside were golden treasures weighing about 7 pounds in total. Two bucket-shaped vessels turned upside down, 3 golden cups, heavy rings, necklaces, bracelets. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the vessels decorated with detailed scenes of warriors and battles. But what made this discovery truly remarkable was what lay inside those golden vessels. A black, sticky residue that forensic analysis revealed to be a mixture of opium and cannabis. The Scythians hadn't just been using cannabis. They had been using it in combination with other psychoactive substances, creating powerful concoctions that could induce profound altered states of consciousness. Think about what this means. These weren't simple savages getting high for entertainment. These were sophisticated people who understood the properties of psychoactive plants, who knew how to combine them for specific effects, who valued these substances so highly that they crafted golden vessels to hold them and buried these treasures with their dead. The residue being found inside the vessels rather than outside suggests they may have brewed the opium and cannabis together as a drink, while simultaneously burning cannabis nearby to produce smoke. The golden vessels themselves tell stories. One depicts an old, bearded man slaying younger warriors. Scholars initially interpreted this as showing actual battles, perhaps the legendary Bastard Wars mentioned in some accounts of Scythian succession struggles. But others suggest it's more metaphorical, representing the cosmic battle between order and chaos that occurred when a king died, the disruption in the spiritual realm that needed to be healed through ritual, through sacrifice, and quite possibly through the careful use of psychoactive substances. Cannabis wasn't just present in royal burials. Archaeological excavations across former Scythian territories, from Romania in the west to the Pamir Mountains in the east, have revealed cannabis burning kits in graves of both men and women, commoners and nobility. These weren't ceremonial objects kept for special occasions. They were personal items, well worn from repeated use, as common in Scythian graves as weapons and jewelry. This suggests that cannabis use was part of everyday Scythian life, not just reserved for funerals or major religious ceremonies. People likely used it for relaxation, for pain relief, for spiritual communion, for socializing. The anthropologist Adrian Mayer notes that finding these kits in women's graves as well as men's is particularly significant. It suggests that Scythian women, including the fierce warrior women the Greeks called Amazons, were full participants in their culture's cannabis practices. Yes, the Amazons were real. Those legendary warrior women weren't just Greek fantasy. Archaeological evidence from Scythian burial mounds has revealed numerous graves of women buried with weapons, armor, and battle wounds, confirming the Greek and Persian accounts of female warriors riding and fighting alongside men. And many of these warrior women were also buried with cannabis kits, suggesting they participated in the same rituals as their male counterparts. Imagine a young Scythian woman, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, sitting in a felt tent after a successful raid. The horses are hobbled outside, munching contentedly on the endless grass. Inside the tent, she and her companions, both men and women, have built a small fire and heated stones until they glow red. Someone produces a leather pouch containing dried cannabis flowers, and they sprinkle them carefully onto the hot stones. The tent fills with thick, fragrant smoke. They breathe deeply, pulling the vapor into their lungs, feeling the tension of the raid drain away, feeling their awareness shift and expand. Someone starts singing, an old song about the ancestors who ride forever across the sky. Someone else begins to laugh, that deep, joyful laughter that seems to come from somewhere beyond the self. The boundaries between individuals begin to blur. They are no longer separate warriors but parts of something larger, a tribe, a people, a river of consciousness flowing across the steppes. This is how cannabis spread westward. The Scythians carried it through their trade contacts, their wars, their cultural exchanges. Greeks learned about it from the Scythians. Romans encountered it through the Greeks. Germanic tribes acquired knowledge of it during their conflicts and commerce with Scythian groups. Slowly, steadily, cannabis knowledge spread across Europe, though it would be many centuries before it took root as firmly in the West as it had in the East. But the Scythians weren't the only people spreading cannabis across the ancient world. The plant was also moving south and west through different channels, along different trade routes, finding homes in different cultures. We need to follow these other paths to see how cannabis wove itself into the religious and medical practices of India, Persia, and the Middle East. Let your mind drift now, like smoke rising from hot stones, drifting up and up until it catches the wind and travels across mountains and deserts to new lands, where the story of cannabis continues in temples and gardens, in the hands of mystics and physicians. The Indian subcontinent welcomed cannabis perhaps 4,000 years ago, carried there by the same Indo-European migrations that brought new languages, new agricultural techniques, and new spiritual ideas. But if cannabis arrived as a stranger, it quickly became family, woven so deeply into the cultural and religious fabric of India that it became almost impossible to imagine Hindu spirituality without it. The earliest mentions of cannabis in India appear in the Vedas, the ancient Sanskrit texts that form the foundation of Hindu religious literature. These texts, compiled somewhere between 2000 and 1400 before the Common Era, describe cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants, as a source of happiness and joy, as a gift from the gods meant to help humanity attain delight and lose fear. The Atharva Veda, in particular, calls cannabis sacred grass, and celebrates its ability to free people from anxiety. In these early Vedic times, cannabis was prepared in a drink called bhang, typically mixed with milk, spices, and sometimes honey. This wasn't just a recreational beverage. It was a sacrament, a way of communing with the divine, particularly with the god Shiva, who became especially associated with cannabis use. The legends about Shiva and cannabis are numerous and enchanting. One popular story tells of Shiva wandering alone in the fields after an argument with his family. Exhausted from the conflict in the blazing Indian sun, he fell asleep under a tall plant with distinctive leaves. When he woke, his curiosity drew him to sample the leaves of this plant. He felt instantly rejuvenated, refreshed, his anger and fatigue melting away like morning dew. From that day forward, cannabis became his favorite food, and he earned the title Lord of Bhang. Whether or not Shiva actually existed, whether or not he actually discovered cannabis, the association between this god and this plant shaped Indian culture profoundly. Devotees of Shiva, called Shaivites, incorporated cannabis into their spiritual practices. Holy men called sadhus, wandering ascetics who renounced worldly possessions in pursuit of enlightenment, used bhang as a tool for meditation and spiritual insight. Even today, cannabis remains legal in certain religious contexts in India, sold at government-authorized bhang shops during festivals, particularly during Holi and the festival of Shivaratri, Shiva's great night. But cannabis wasn't only spiritual in India. It was also deeply medicinal. The ancient system of Ayurvedic medicine, which developed alongside the Vedic religious traditions, recognized cannabis as a valuable therapeutic substance. Ayurvedic physicians prescribed it for pain relief, for digestive problems, for insomnia, for dozens of different conditions. The 1893 British Indian Hemp Drug Commission, which conducted one of the first comprehensive studies of cannabis use, found that moderate cannabis consumption was common across India and generally not harmful. The report noted fascinating variations in how different Indian communities used cannabis. In some cities, only the elite consumed it. In others, it was used equally by rich and poor. In some regions, it was primarily used by religious practitioners, while in others it was a common intoxicant among laborers. But across all these variations, one pattern held. Cannabis was integrated into the culture, accepted, regulated by social norms rather than prohibited outright. From India, cannabis knowledge spread in multiple directions. Buddhist monks carried it to Southeast Asia and East Asia. Trade caravans carried it west along the Silk Road into Persia and the Middle East. Arab traders carried it south and west into Africa. Each culture that encountered cannabis adapted it to their own needs and traditions. In Persia, cannabis found fertile ground both literally and culturally. The climate was suitable for cultivation, and Persian physicians, building on Greek and Indian medical knowledge, developed sophisticated understandings of the plant's therapeutic properties. The great Persian physician Avicenna, writing in the 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era, documented cannabis in his medical encyclopedia, noting its uses and effects with scientific precision. Cannabis spread throughout the Middle Eastern world during the Islamic Golden Age, that remarkable period between roughly the 8th and 14th centuries when Islamic civilization led the world in science, mathematics, medicine, and culture. Interestingly, cannabis wasn't forbidden by Islamic law the way alcohol was. While some religious scholars condemned its recreational use, others recognized its medicinal value, and it remained widely available and commonly used across the Islamic world. The Sufi tradition, Islamic mysticism focused on direct personal experience of the divine, embraced cannabis with particular enthusiasm. Sufi practitioners believed that cannabis could help them achieve the altered states of consciousness necessary for spiritual enlightenment. They used it in their dhikr ceremonies, their repetitive chanting and meditation practices designed to bring them closer to God. For the Sufis, cannabis wasn't an escape from reality but a door to a deeper reality, a way of penetrating the veils that separate the human from the divine. In medieval Arabic literature, cannabis appears regularly, often as hashish, a word that simply means grass in Arabic. The famous Tales of the Thousand and One Nights refers to cannabis as a magic plant that gives joy and brightens the spirit. Persian poets wrote verses celebrating its effects. Arab physicians documented its medical applications in detail that would later influence European medicine when these texts were translated during the Renaissance. One particularly influential Arab physician, Ibn Washiyah, wrote a book called On Poisons in the 10th century, which included detailed information about cannabis. He documented both its beneficial effects and its potential dangers, particularly when mixed with other substances. This kind of systematic documentation, combining observation with theory, helped establish cannabis as a legitimate subject of medical study rather than simply a folk remedy or recreational substance. But cannabis knowledge in the Islamic world wasn't confined to medical texts and Sufi ceremonies. It existed in the everyday lives of people, in the stories they told, in the legends that grew and transformed with each retelling. And few legends about cannabis have proven as enduring, as controversial, and as historically questionable as the story of the Assassins, the deadly sect supposedly fueled by hashish who struck terror into the hearts of rulers across the medieval Middle East. Let us turn our attention now to the mountains of northern Persia, to a fortress perched on a seemingly impregnable crag, to a charismatic and ruthless leader, and to a legend that would shape Western perceptions of cannabis for centuries to come. Close your eyes and imagine a fortress carved from the living rock of a mountain, its walls rising seamlessly from the stone cliffs as if the mountain itself had grown them. This is Alamat, whose name translates beautifully as Eagle's Nest, a castle fortress situated in the Alborz Mountains of northern Iran, about 60 miles from the Caspian Sea. The fortress sits atop a narrow ridge of rock, nearly 6,500 feet above sea level, accessible only by a single treacherous path that winds up the mountainside like a serpent. On a clear day, standing on the walls of Alamat, you could see for miles in every direction. You could watch caravans moving along distant roads like lines of ants. You could spot approaching armies while they were still days away from your gates. You could feel like a god surveying the world from your throne in the clouds. This was the headquarters of Hassan-i Sabbah, founder of the Nizari Ismaili state, the man who would become infamous throughout the medieval world as the Old Man of the Mountain, the master of the assassins. To understand this remarkable figure and the organization he built, we need to step back and understand the political and religious landscape of the medieval Islamic world. Hassan-i Sabbah was born around 1050 in the city of Qam in Persia, into a Twelver Shia Muslim family. He received an excellent education, studying theology, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. According to his own memoirs, fragments of which survive, he was converted to Ismailism, a branch of Shia Islam, at the age of 17. This conversion would shape the entire trajectory of his life. Ismailism was a minority sect within an already minority branch of Islam. Ismailis believed that spiritual authority passed through a line of divinely appointed imams descended from Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. But unlike other Shia groups, the Ismailis recognized a different succession of imams, and this theological difference made them targets of persecution from both Sunni and other Shia authorities. Hassan became increasingly devoted to the Ismaili cause. He traveled to Egypt, the center of Ismaili power under the Fatimid Caliphate, where he studied and worked on behalf of the faith. But Hassan was not content to remain a scholar or a preacher. He had grander visions. He dreamed of creating an independent Ismaili state, a refuge where his faith could flourish without persecution, a base from which the true faith could spread. In 1090, Hassan achieved the first step toward this dream. Through a combination of cunning, persuasion, and careful planning, he seized control of Alamat Castle. The story of how he accomplished this tells us much about his character. He didn't attack the castle with an army. Instead, he sent his followers to infiltrate the area, to convert the local population, to gain supporters within the castle itself. When Hassan finally appeared and demanded the castle's surrender, The garrison commander found that most of his own men had already converted to Ismailism. The castle fell without a single drop of blood being shed. From this impregnable base, Hassan built what became known as the Nizari Ismaili state, a network of fortresses scattered across Persia and Syria, connected by secret communication lines and loyal followers. But Hassan's most famous innovation, the strategy that would make his name synonymous with political murder, was the systematic use of assassination as a political and military tool. The Nizaris were vastly outnumbered by their enemies. The Seljuk Turks, who controlled most of Persia, were Sunni Muslims who viewed the Ismailis as dangerous heretics. The Nizaris couldn't hope to defeat the Seljuks in open warfare. So Hassan developed a different strategy: targeted killings of key enemy leaders, carried out by devoted followers willing to sacrifice their own lives to complete their missions. These operatives, called Fidai or Fadi'in, meaning those who sacrifice themselves, were trained extensively in combat, disguise, and infiltration. They would spend months or even years getting close to their target, learning their habits, gaining their trust. Then, at the perfect moment, they would strike, typically with a dagger in a public place where the killing would have maximum psychological impact. Often, the Fidai made no attempt to escape, accepting their own death as martyrdom in service to their faith. The strategy was terrifyingly effective. In 1092, Hassan's Fidai assassinated Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire and one of the Nizari's most dangerous enemies. The vizier was traveling in his litter when a Fidai disguised as a Sufi mystic approached and stabbed him to death. A few weeks later, another Fidai killed the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah. Suddenly, the Nizari Ismailis went from being dismissed as a minor sect to being feared across the Islamic world. Over the following decades, the Nizaris carried out dozens of high-profile assassinations. They killed caliphs and sultans, generals and governors, anyone who threatened their community or opposed their faith. The mere threat of Nizari assassination became a powerful political tool. Rulers thought twice before moving against the Nizaris when they knew that such action might result in a dagger between their ribs. Hassan himself never left Alamut after seizing it in 1090. For the next 35 years until his death in 1124, he remained in his mountain fortress, directing his followers, studying, writing, and building his network of fortresses and agents. Contemporary accounts describe him as an ascetic figure, deeply devoted to his faith, ruthlessly devoted to his cause. He supposedly had two of his own sons executed, one for drinking wine and one for being involved in a murder that Hassan himself hadn't ordered, demonstrating that his strict code applied even to his own family. Now here's where our story intersects with cannabis, and where history becomes tangled with legend. The word assassin that we use in English comes from the Arabic hashishin, which has often been translated as hashish users. This has led to centuries of stories claiming that Hassan's Fidai were motivated by drugs, that Hassan would drug them with hashish and then show them a secret garden designed to look like paradise, complete with beautiful women, flowing water, and luxurious pleasures. According to this legend, Hassan told his drugged followers that this was a preview of the paradise that awaited them if they died carrying out his orders. Thus motivated, they would fearlessly carry out suicide missions, knowing that death would return them to this paradise. This story appears most famously in the writings of Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who traveled through Persia in the 13th century. In his accounts, Marco Polo describes the old man of the mountain's secret garden in vivid detail. Beautiful pavilions, fountains flowing with wine, milk, honey, and water, singing and dancing girls, every pleasure imaginable. Young men would be drugged, brought to this garden, allowed to enjoy its pleasures, then drugged again and removed. When they woke, they believed they had experienced paradise, and they would do anything to return there, including dying on command. It's a compelling story, dramatic and exotic, perfectly designed to fascinate European audiences. There's only one problem: it's almost certainly false. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked the hashish garden legend. There are several reasons why this story doesn't hold up to scrutiny. First, there's no mention of hashish or secret gardens in any contemporary Persian or Arabic sources about the Nizaris. The earliest Islamic accounts of Hassan and the assassins, written by their enemies who had every reason to make them look bad, never mention drugs or gardens. They described the Nizaris as dangerous religious fanatics, certainly, but as fanatics motivated by genuine belief, not by drug-induced delusions. Second, the word hashishin itself is controversial. Some scholars argue it was a derogatory term meaning lowlifes or rabble rather than hashish users. Others point out that the term doesn't even appear in contemporary sources but was applied retrospectively, possibly influenced by the European travelers' tales. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the secret garden story makes no practical sense. Hassan didn't need to drug his followers to secure their loyalty. He had something far more powerful: genuine religious conviction. The Ismailis believed they were fighting for divine truth against oppressive heretics. The Fidai weren't mindless drug addicts. They were educated, intelligent believers who viewed their sacrifice as martyrdom for a righteous cause. They trained for years, planned meticulously, and struck with precision. This isn't the behavior of people acting under the influence of drugs. So why did the hashish legend persist? Partly because it served the narrative purposes of both Muslim and Christian writers. For Muslim enemies of the Nazaris, the drug story undermined the assassins' religious legitimacy, making them look like criminals rather than principled opponents. For European Christians encountering these stories through travelers' tales, the hashish garden legend fit perfectly with their existing stereotypes about the decadent, drug-using Orient. It was exotic, titillating, and reassuringly different from Christian civilization. Marco Polo's account, written around 1300, was particularly influential in spreading this legend in Europe. But we should remember that Marco Polo was writing decades after the Nizari state had been destroyed, relying on second-hand stories and local legends rather than first-hand observation. He was also writing for an audience that wanted exotic tales from the mysterious East. Whether he intentionally fabricated the garden story or simply reported local legends as fact remains unclear, but the result was the same. The association between the assassins and hashish became fixed in European imagination. The reality of the Nizari Ismailis was far more interesting than the legend. They weren't drug-crazed fanatics but sophisticated political operators who developed one of history's most effective asymmetric warfare strategies. They created a state that survived for nearly 2 centuries in the face of powerful enemies. They built libraries, studied philosophy and science, developed complex theological arguments. The fortress of Alamut contained one of the finest libraries in the Islamic world, with texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. The Nizari state finally fell in 1256, not to the Seljuks or any Muslim army but to the Mongols. When Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, swept through Persia with his unstoppable armies, even the eagle's nest couldn't hold out. The Mongols besieged Alamut, and the last Nizari Imam, recognizing the futility of resistance, surrendered. The Mongols destroyed the fortress, burned its legendary library, and hunted down the remaining Nizari leaders. Most were executed, though some Ismaili communities survived and continue to exist today. So what's the truth about the assassins and cannabis? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain whether the Nizari Fidai used hashish or not. Cannabis was certainly available in medieval Persia and was widely used for both medicinal and recreational purposes. It's entirely possible that some members of the Nizari community used it, just as members of many communities across the Islamic world did. But the idea that hashish was central to the assassins' operations, that it was used to brainwash followers or create artificial paradises, is almost certainly a myth. What the legend does tell us is how cannabis became entangled with Western fears and fantasies about the Islamic world. The word assassin entered European languages carrying with it associations with drugs, with Oriental duplicity, with irrational violence. These associations would shape Western attitudes toward cannabis for centuries, adding a layer of fear and exoticism to a plant that had been used medicinally and spiritually across numerous cultures for thousands of years. Let your mind rest now with this image. The ruins of Alamut, still perched on their rocky crag in northern Iran, empty and silent after 7.5 centuries. The walls that once seemed impregnable are crumbling. The library is long gone, its irreplaceable manuscripts lost to Mongol fire. The eagle's nest sits abandoned, home only to wind and memory. But the legends live on, mixing truth with fiction, history with mythology, until it becomes almost impossible to separate one from the other. And perhaps that's fitting. The story of cannabis through history has always been a mixture of fact and legend, of medicine and mysticism, of practical use and spiritual seeking. From the steppes of Mongolia to the mountains of Persia, from the courts of Chinese emperors to the tents of Scythian warriors, from the temples of India to the fortresses of the assassins, cannabis has been present, sometimes celebrated, sometimes feared, always woven into the complex narrative of human culture. But our journey through history isn't complete. We followed a plant across 5,000 years in half the world. Now it's time to turn our attention to two extraordinary women whose lives were shaped not by cannabis but by power, politics, poison, and passion. Women who lived centuries apart but shared a common experience, being defined by legends that bore only passing resemblance to their actual lives. Let yourself drift now across centuries and continents, from the medieval Islamic world to Renaissance Italy, from mountain fortresses to marble palaces, from the age of faith to the age of reason. We're about to meet a woman whose very name became synonymous with poison and political intrigue, yet whose real life tells a far more complicated and ultimately more human story. The year is 1480, and in the city of Subiaco, about 40 miles east of Rome, a baby girl has just been born. She enters the world under circumstances that many would consider scandalous, though in the labyrinthine world of Renaissance Italian politics, such scandals are almost routine. Her father is Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish-born churchman who has risen high in the Catholic hierarchy despite, or perhaps because of, his complete disregard for his vows of celibacy. Her mother is Venazia de Catania, a Roman woman of minor noble birth who serves as the cardinal's long-term mistress. The baby is named Lucrezia, and she is beautiful. This beauty will shape her destiny in ways both fortunate and terrible. It will make her a valuable pawn in the political games of powerful men. It will inspire poetry and art. It will attract suitors and enemies in equal measure. And it will eventually become so entangled with legends of poison and corruption that centuries later, people will struggle to see the real woman beneath the mythology. Lucrezia grows up in comfort, educated as befits a noble daughter of the Renaissance. She learns to read and write in Italian, Spanish, and Latin. She studies poetry, music, and dance. She learns the complex art of embroidery, her needle creating delicate patterns on silk and linen. But more importantly, she learns to navigate the treacherous world of Renaissance politics, watching and absorbing the lessons of power from the two most Machiavellian figures of the age, her father and her brother. In 1492, when Lucrezia is just 12 years old, her life changes dramatically. Her father, through a combination of bribery, political maneuvering, and sheer ruthless ambition, is elected pope, taking the name Alexander VI. Suddenly, Lucrezia is no longer simply the illegitimate daughter of a cardinal. She's the daughter of the most powerful man in Christendom, or at least the man who occupies what should be the most powerful position. This elevation brings opportunities and dangers in equal measure. Pope Alexander VI is one of the most controversial figures ever to occupy the throne of St. Peter. He's openly corrupt, using his position to enrich his family and advance their political power. He continues his relationship with Venazia even after becoming pope, and he openly acknowledges his children, showering them with titles, lands, and favorable marriages. To modern eyes, this seems shocking, but we must remember that Renaissance Italy operated by different rules than the medieval church that preceded it or the Reformed church that would follow. This was an age when the papacy was as much a political institution as a religious one, when popes led armies, made alliances, and schemed for territory like any secular prince. Alexander was perhaps more blatant about it than most, but he was hardly unique. What set him apart was his complete lack of shame about his behavior, his willingness to flaunt conventions that other churchmen at least pretended to honor. Lucrezia's brother Cesare is even more notorious. Appointed cardinal at 17, he eventually abandons his ecclesiastical career to become a military commander and political operative for his father. Cesare is brilliant, ruthless, and utterly immoral. He conquers cities, eliminates rivals, and builds a personal power base with such effectiveness that Niccolò Machiavelli will later use him as a primary example in The Prince, his famous treatise on political power. Into this world of papal politics and family ambition, Lucrezia is thrust as a valuable game piece. Her beauty and her connection to the Pope make her an extraordinarily desirable bride, and her father wastes no time arranging marriages that will advance Borgia interests. Her first engagement comes when she's just 11 years old, to a Spanish nobleman. But this engagement is broken when a more politically advantageous match presents itself. At 13, she is married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a member of the powerful Sforza family that controls Milan. This marriage creates an alliance between the Borgias and the Sforzas, an alliance that Pope Alexander needs to counter the power of other Italian families. For 3 years, Lucrezia lives as the wife of Giovanni Sforza. We know little about this period of her life, but what we do know suggests it was not particularly happy. Giovanni was significantly older than Lucrezia, and by all accounts, they had little in common. More importantly, the political situation that made their marriage valuable was changing. Pope Alexander decided he needed different alliances, which meant Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni had become a liability rather than an asset. In 1497, Alexander declared that Lucrezia's marriage was null and void, claiming it had never been consummated. This was a convenient fiction that would allow Lucrezia to marry again without the complications of divorce. Giovanni Sforza was outraged, not least because claiming the marriage was unconsummated essentially announced to the world that he was impotent. In his fury, Giovanni made an accusation so shocking that it would haunt Lucrezia for the rest of her life. He claimed the Pope wanted the marriage annulled because he himself was having an incestuous relationship with his daughter. There is no credible historical evidence for this accusation. It appears to have been a malicious rumor spread by a humiliated ex-husband seeking revenge. But the rumor stuck, spreading through Italy and beyond, growing more lurid with each retelling. In the poisonous atmosphere of Renaissance Italian politics, where noble families constantly attacked each other through slander and propaganda, such accusations were common weapons. But they could destroy reputations nonetheless. Shortly after the annulment, Lucrezia gave birth to a child, a boy named Giovanni, whose parentage remains one of history's mysteries. Pope Alexander issued 2 contradictory bulls regarding the child's paternity. One declared the child to be the son of Cesare Borgia and an unnamed Roman woman. The other claimed the child was the son of Pope Alexander himself and the same unnamed woman. Neither bull mentioned Lucrezia as the mother, yet she seems to have raised the child, at least for a time. Historians have puzzled over this mystery for centuries. Some believe Lucrezia was indeed the mother and the bulls were cover stories. Others think the child was Cesare's or Alexander's and was placed in Lucrezia's care. Still others suggest more complicated scenarios involving other Borgia relatives. The truth is we simply don't know, and the contradictory papal bulls may have been deliberately confusing, designed to obscure the truth rather than reveal it. What we do know is that in 1498, Lucrezia was married again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bachelier, an illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This marriage seems to have been genuinely happy, at least initially. Contemporary accounts describe Lucrezia and Alfonso as devoted to each other. They had a son together, Rodrigo, named after Lucrezia's father. For a brief time, it seemed Lucrezia might find some peace and happiness. But the world of Borgia politics was never peaceful for long. The political alliance that made Alfonso useful as a husband shifted once again. Pope Alexander decided he needed French support rather than Neapolitan, which meant Alfonso had transformed from asset to liability. In July of 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He survived the initial assault, though badly wounded, and was taken to the Vatican to recover. Lucrezia nursed him devotedly, barely leaving his side. For a few weeks it seemed he might survive. Then one evening when Lucrezia was briefly absent, assassins entered his room and strangled him to death. Everyone knew who was responsible. Cesare Borgia had ordered the killing, eliminating his sister's husband as a political inconvenience. When asked about it, Cesare reportedly replied that he hadn't ordered Whatever her role had been in previous Borgia schemes, whatever compromises she'd made, she had genuinely loved Alfonso. His murder at her brother's command showed her just how powerless she was, how even her personal happiness could be sacrificed to family political interests. She withdrew into mourning, refusing to see visitors, refusing to participate in her father's court. But Lucrezia couldn't mourn forever. She was still a valuable marriage piece, and the Borgias weren't finished with her yet. In 1501, negotiations began for her third marriage, this time to Alfonso d'Este, son and heir of the Duke of Ferrara. This would be her most prestigious match yet, connecting the Borgias to one of the most established and respected noble families in Italy. But the d'Este family was not eager for this alliance. They considered the Borgias to be upstarts, Spanish adventurers with too much power and not enough breeding. The rumors about Lucrezia, about incest and poison and scandal, made them even more reluctant. Alfonso d'Este himself initially refused to consider the marriage. It took enormous pressure from Pope Alexander, including threats and enormous financial incentives, to convince the d'Este family to accept Lucrezia. The dowry was astronomical, over 100,000 ducats, along with significant political concessions and guarantees. The d'Este family was buying a papal alliance, and they were extracting as high a price as possible for accepting the scandalous Borgia daughter. The wedding took place in December 1501, and Lucrezia traveled to Ferrara with a magnificent retinue, dressed in clothes of silk and gold, bringing with her cartloads of wedding gifts and dowry goods. The celebrations lasted for days, with tournaments, theatrical performances, and elaborate banquets. It was a spectacle designed to demonstrate Borgia power and wealth, to show the d'Este family and all of Italy that the Borgias had arrived as legitimate nobility, not merely upstart papal adventurers. And here we must pause to address the legend that has become most associated with Lucrezia Borgia. The poison ring, the idea that she went through life wearing a special ring with a hidden compartment containing deadly poison, which she could secretly add to the drinks of her enemies or her father's enemies. This image has become so iconic that you can find countless artistic depictions of Lucrezia with her poison ring, countless novels and films showing her casually poisoning courtiers at dinner parties. The problem is that there's no historical evidence whatsoever that Lucrezia ever possessed such a ring or ever poisoned anyone. This legend appears to have originated centuries after her death, part of the general black legend of the Borgias that grew up in the Protestant Reformation era. Protestant propagandists, eager to demonstrate papal corruption, exaggerated and invented stories about the Borgia family. The poison ring specifically seems to have been a 19th century invention, appearing in sensational novels and plays about Lucrezia's life. The truth is that while poison was certainly used in Renaissance Italy, and while the Borgias had plenty of enemies who died under suspicious circumstances, there's no credible evidence linking Lucrezia to any poisonings. Her father and brother were suspected of various poisonings, and those suspicions may have had some basis in reality. But Lucrezia herself was never accused of poisoning anyone during her lifetime. The accusations came later, part of the mythologizing that turned her from a real person into a symbol of female wickedness and corruption. What was Lucrezia really like? The historical record from her time in Ferrara paints a surprisingly positive picture. Far from being a poisonous schemer, she seems to have been an intelligent, cultured woman who took her duties as duchess seriously and eventually won over the family that had initially resented her so deeply. She became a patron of the arts, supporting poets, painters, and musicians. She maintained an active correspondence with prominent intellectuals of her day, discussing literature and philosophy. She involved herself in the government of Ferrara, acting as regent when her husband was away on military campaigns. Contemporary accounts from Ferrarese courtiers, written for private consumption rather than public propaganda, describe her as capable, gracious, and kind. One poet who knew her well, Ercole Strozzi, wrote verses praising her beauty and intelligence, her skill at conversation, her genuine kindness to those around her. When he was murdered under mysterious circumstances in 1508, Lucrezia mourned him deeply, suggesting a genuine friendship rather than the manipulative relationships portrayed in the legends. Some historians have even speculated they may have been lovers, though this remains conjecture. Lucrezia bore several children during her years in Ferrara. Her relationship with Alfonso d'Este, while perhaps not passionate, seems to have been respectful and functional. He gave her considerable authority and trusted her to handle important matters in his absence. When critics at the Ferrarese court complained about Lucrezia in the early years of her marriage, Alfonso defended her. Whatever initial reluctance he'd felt about the match, he came to value his Borgia wife. Life became more difficult for Lucrezia after her father's death in 1503 and her brother's subsequent fall from power. The protection of papal authority vanished, and the Borgia political network collapsed rapidly. Cesare, who had seemed invincible just months earlier, found himself imprisoned and powerless. He would eventually die in battle in Spain in 1507, killed in an obscure skirmish that seemed almost anticlimactic for such a notorious figure. Without her father and brother, Lucrezia was truly on her own for the first time in her life. But rather than falling apart, she seems to have flourished. No longer a pawn in someone else's political games, she could finally define herself by her own choices and actions. She focused on her children, on her cultural patronage, on her role as Duchess. She became deeply religious in her later years, though this was perhaps more genuine piety than political calculation, a turning towards spirituality as she approached the end of her life. She died in 1519 at the age of 39 from complications of childbirth. Her 10th pregnancy had gone badly, and she never recovered from the delivery of a stillborn daughter. As she lay dying, she expressed regret for her past sins, though she didn't specify what those sins were. She asked to be buried in simple dress, without the jewels and finery that had marked her public life. She left generous gifts to convents and charitable institutions. Her husband Alfonso mourned her sincerely. Her children remembered her with affection. The people of Ferrara, who had initially viewed her with suspicion, genuinely grieved for their duchess. These responses suggest that whatever Lucrezia had been in her youth, whatever role she had played in Borgia schemes, she had become something different by the end of her life. A capable ruler, a generous patron, a devoted mother, a complex human being rather than a one-dimensional villainess. So why did the poisonous legend persist? Partly because the Borgia family as a whole had such a terrible reputation that Lucrezia was guilty by association. Partly because the Protestant Reformation needed examples of papal corruption, and the Borgias provided perfect material. Partly because later centuries projected their own anxieties about female sexuality and power onto Lucrezia, turning her into a femme fatale figure that said more about the fears of the men creating these legends than about Lucrezia herself. The 19th century in particular was fascinated with Lucrezia Borgia. Victor Hugo wrote a play about her. Donizetti composed an opera. Countless novels portrayed her as a beautiful, dangerous woman who poisoned her enemies and seduced powerful men. These works of art had little to do with historical reality, but they captured the imagination of audiences who wanted tales of exotic Renaissance corruption. Modern historians have worked to rehabilitate Lucrezia's reputation, examining contemporary documents rather than later legends, reconstructing what we can know about her actual life rather than the mythical version. What emerges is a far more nuanced and ultimately more interesting figure. A woman born into an impossibly corrupt family who managed, despite everything, to carve out a space for herself, who survived scandals and tragedies that would have destroyed weaker people, who learned from her experiences and grew into a genuinely respected and even beloved figure. Was she complicit in Borgia crimes? Probably, at least to some degree. It's hard to imagine growing up in that family and remaining completely innocent. But was she the poisoning seductress of legend? Almost certainly not. She was something more complicated. A survivor, a political pawn who became a skilled player, a woman constrained by the limitations of her time who nevertheless found ways to exercise agency and authority. Let yourself rest now with this image. Lucrezia on her deathbed, surrounded by candles and praying clergy, dying as piously as any medieval saint despite all the scandals of her youth. She has outlived her father and brother. She has survived 3 husbands and countless political upheavals. She has transformed from the Pope's notorious daughter into the respected Duchess of Ferrara. The poison ring never existed, the worst rumors were never true, but the truth of her life was dramatic enough without embellishment. And now our story shifts again, backward in time and northward across the Alps, to France and then England, to another woman whose life was so extraordinary that legends grew up around her even while she still lived. A woman who was queen of 2 kingdoms, who went on crusade, who was imprisoned by her husband, who lived into her 80s in an age when most people died decades younger. Let us meet Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most remarkable woman of the entire medieval period. Picture Aquitaine in the early 12th century, a region in southwestern France larger and richer than the Kingdom of France itself. This duchy stretches from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south, from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Massif Central in the east. Its territory includes some of the finest wine-growing regions in Europe, prosperous trading cities, important monasteries and churches. Its dukes are among the most powerful nobles in Europe, owing only nominal allegiance to the French crown and commanding resources that kings might envy. In 1122, a daughter is born to Duke William X of Aquitaine and his wife Enna. They name her Eleanor, a name derived from Enna itself, and from her first breath, this child is destined for extraordinary things, though no one yet realizes just how extraordinary her life will be. Eleanor grows up in the cultured court of Aquitaine, which is renowned for its patronage of poetry and music. Her grandfather, William IX, was himself a troubadour, one of the first poets to compose in the Occitan language, writing verses about love and longing that scandalized some and delighted others. The court of Aquitaine is where the concept of courtly love is taking shape, where poets are beginning to write of love as a noble, ennobling passion rather than mere lust or dynastic obligation. Young Eleanor receives an education far superior to what most women of her era, even noble women, would receive. She learns to read in Latin and in the langue d'oc of her homeland. She studies history, philosophy, and theology. She learns music and poetry, how to play instruments and appreciate the songs of troubadours. Most importantly, she learns about power, watching her father govern his vast duchy, learning the arts of diplomacy and command that will serve her throughout her remarkable life. Then in 1130 tragedy strikes. Eleanor's older brother and heir to the duchy dies, making Eleanor herself the heir to Aquitaine. 7 years later, her father dies as well, and at the age of just 15, Eleanor becomes Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, the wealthiest heiress in Europe, controller of lands and resources that would make her the prize catch of her generation. But Eleanor's independence as Duchess is short-lived. Within months of her father's death, she is married to Louis, the 17-year-old son and heir of King Louis VI of France. This marriage is arranged hastily, before other nobles can make competing offers for Eleanor's hand. When Louis's father dies shortly after the wedding, Eleanor finds herself Queen of France at age 15, married to a young man who has just become King Louis VII. On the surface, this seems like a fairy tale. The beautiful Duchess becomes Queen of France, uniting her vast southern territories with the French crown, creating a realm of unprecedented size and power. But the reality is far more complicated. Eleanor and Louis are profoundly mismatched. Louis is deeply pious, withdrawn, almost monkish in his habits. He's been raised for the church, only becoming heir to the throne after his older brother died. He's uncomfortable with the pleasures of court life, uneasy with displays of wealth and luxury. Eleanor, by contrast, is worldly, sophisticated, cultured. She's accustomed to the refined court of Aquitaine, to music and poetry and intellectual conversation. She finds the French court, and particularly her pious husband, suffocating. Contemporary chronicles describe growing tension between the royal couple, though in their early years they maintain at least a public show of unity. Then comes the defining adventure of Eleanor's first marriage, the Second Crusade. In 1145, Pope Eugenius III calls for a new crusade to support the Crusader states in the Holy Land, which are facing renewed pressure from Islamic forces. Louis VII, perhaps seeing this as an opportunity to prove himself as a warrior king rather than a monk king, takes the cross, pledging to join the crusade. Eleanor decides to join him, and this decision is remarkable for several reasons. First, it's highly unusual for a queen to accompany her husband on crusade. The journey is long, dangerous, and expensive. Second, Eleanor doesn't go alone. She brings with her a large contingent of noble women from Aquitaine, along with a substantial military force of knights and soldiers from her duchy. Some contemporary sources suggest she and her ladies dressed as Amazons for the departure ceremony, deliberately evoking the legendary warrior women of classical mythology. The crusade is a disaster almost from the start. The French army, traveling overland through hostile territory, suffers from poor planning, lack of supplies, and constant attacks. The German crusading army, traveling the same route slightly ahead of them, has already been badly mauled, and the French find themselves following a trail marked by German corpses and destroyed camps. By the time the Crusaders reach Antioch in 1148, the army is exhausted, depleted, and demoralized. Here, Eleanor meets her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. Raymond is a sophisticated, charismatic ruler who has carved out a successful Crusader principality in the Levant. He and Eleanor share the same Aquitanian culture, the same love of poetry and learning. They get along remarkably well, perhaps too well for Louis's comfort. Exactly what happened in Antioch remains one of the great mysteries and scandals of Eleanor's life. Later sources, particularly those hostile to Eleanor, would accuse her of having an affair with her uncle, though this seems unlikely given that such an incestuous relationship would have been considered particularly shocking even by medieval standards. More probably, Eleanor simply enjoyed spending time with someone who shared her cultural background and interests, while Louis fumed jealously. The real conflict in Antioch was political rather than sexual. Raymond wanted the Crusader army to help him attack Aleppo, a strategic target that would significantly strengthen the Crusader states. This was a sensible military objective. But Louis refused, insisting that the army should proceed to Jerusalem instead. Eleanor sided with her uncle, arguing passionately for Raymond's plan. She used her influence as queen and as the leader of the Aquitanian contingent to press Louis to change his mind. Louis refused to budge, and the argument between the royal couple became increasingly bitter. According to some accounts, Eleanor threatened to seek an annulment of their marriage on the grounds of consanguinity. They were, in fact, related within degrees that theoretically prohibited marriage by church law, though such relationships were common among medieval nobility and could usually be overlooked when convenient. The threat of annulment, however, was serious. If Eleanor left Louis and reclaimed her duchy, the French crown would lose control of Aquitaine, dramatically weakening the kingdom. Louis's response was shocking. He essentially kidnapped his own wife. Under cover of darkness, he had Eleanor forcibly removed from Antioch and taken with the army as it marched to Jerusalem. This violation of Eleanor's autonomy, treating her as property rather than as a person with rights and desires of her own, must have been deeply humiliating and probably marked the final end of any affection between them. The crusade continued to go badly. The Crusaders' attack on Damascus, the main military action of the crusade, was a complete failure. The Crusaders were forced to retreat in disarray, having accomplished nothing except exhausting their armies and wasting enormous resources. Louis and Eleanor returned to France separately, the rift between them now impossible to hide. For the next few years, they maintained the pretense of their marriage, but everyone knew it was over. Eleanor had borne Louis 2 daughters, but no son, and medieval thinking blamed this on the wife rather than the husband. Finally, in 1152, the marriage was annulled by church officials on the grounds of consanguinity, the very excuse Eleanor had threatened in Antioch. After 15 years of marriage, Eleanor was free, but she was also in a vulnerable position. As a single woman of 30, even a wealthy duchess, she was at risk of being forced into another political marriage by any nobleman strong enough to seize her. What happened next shocked all of Europe and changed the course of history. Within weeks of her annulment from Louis, Eleanor married Henry of Anjou, who was not only Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou but also the heir to the English throne. He was 18 years old to Eleanor's 30, but by all accounts this was not a marriage forced on Eleanor but one she chose herself. Think about what this means. Eleanor, freshly divorced from one king, immediately married a man who would soon become another king. She traded being Queen of France for being Duchess of Normandy and future Queen of England. And in doing so, she created a situation that would dominate European politics for the next 3 centuries. The Angevin Empire, a collection of territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, with the kings of England holding more territory in France than the kings of France themselves controlled. This was an act of extraordinary political audacity. Eleanor wasn't simply a pawn being moved from one husband to another. She was making a choice, selecting a husband who shared her energy and ambition, who appreciated her intelligence and capabilities, who could give her the partnership she'd never had with Louis. Yes, Henry was 12 years younger, but he was already proving himself a formidable military commander and political operator. He was in many ways Eleanor's match. When Henry became King of England in 1154, 2 years after their marriage, Eleanor became Queen of England, one of the most powerful women in Europe. But she retained her rights to Aquitaine, never ceding her duchy to her husband's control. She continued to govern Aquitaine in her own right, maintaining its distinct identity and laws, ensuring that her southern realm wasn't simply absorbed into English or Angevin administration. For the first 15 years or so of their marriage, Eleanor and Henry worked together remarkably effectively. Eleanor gave birth to 8 children, including 5 sons, ensuring the succession in a way she never had with Louis. She served as regent when Henry was away, governing England or parts of his continental domains with skill and authority. Contemporary chronicles record her making judicial decisions, issuing charters, handling diplomatic negotiations. But Henry was never an easy man to live with. He was energetic to the point of exhaustion, constantly moving from place to place, unable to sit still, driving his courtiers to distraction with his relentless pace. He was also notoriously unfaithful, taking numerous mistresses, including most famously Rosamond Clifford, Fair Rosamond, whose relationship with Henry became so public that it humiliated Eleanor. Legend says Eleanor had Rosamond poisoned or murdered, but like so many legends about powerful women, this appears to be false. Rosamond actually retired to a convent and died of natural causes years later. But the legend tells us something about how Eleanor was perceived, as a woman capable of anything, including murder, to protect her position and dignity. The real break between Eleanor and Henry came not over a mistress but over their sons. Eleanor had given Henry heirs for sons who survived to adulthood: Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. As these sons grew into young men, they became increasingly restless, wanting real power rather than mere titles. Henry the Elder, as we might call him to distinguish him from his eldest son, was reluctant to give them genuine authority, preferring to keep all real power in his own hands. Eleanor, watching her sons being frustrated in encouraging her sons, providing them with resources from Aquitaine, even attempting to join them in France when the rebellion began. This was an act of extraordinary defiance. Medieval queens were expected to be mediators between fathers and sons, not active partisans in family conflicts. Eleanor crossed that line decisively, choosing her son's interest over her husband's authority. It was a gamble that would cost her dearly. The rebellion failed. Henry the Elder, despite being over 40 and facing enemies on multiple fronts, proved to be a brilliant military strategist. He defeated his sons' armies, reconciled with the sons themselves, pardoned the rebel barons who had supported them. But he did not forgive Eleanor. She was captured while trying to flee to France, allegedly dressed in men's clothing to avoid protection. Henry had her imprisoned, and this imprisonment would last for nearly 16 years, from 1173 to 1189. 16 years, think about that. Eleanor, who had been Queen of France and Queen of England, who had gone on crusade, who had governed kingdoms, was locked away in various royal castles, cut off from power, from her children, from any meaningful participation in the world she had once dominated. We know very little about Eleanor's life during these years of imprisonment. She wasn't held in a dungeon or tortured. She was kept in royal castles with a household of servants, allowed to receive visitors on occasion, permitted to go hunting under close supervision. But she was a prisoner nonetheless, her movements controlled, her political influence nullified. For a woman who had shaped the destiny of nations, this enforced powerlessness must have been agonizing. During these years, her world continued without her. Her son Henry the young king died of dysentery in 1183, leaving her unable to comfort him in his final illness. Her third son, Geoffrey, died in a tournament accident in 1186, again without Eleanor being able to see him. Her relationship with her remaining sons, Richard and John, evolved in her absence, influenced by their father rather than by her. Then, in 1189, everything changed again. Henry II died, and Richard, Eleanor's favorite son, became king. One of Richard's first acts as king was to free his mother from imprisonment. Eleanor, now 67 years old, an age when most medieval people were long dead, was finally free. And rather than retiring to comfortable obscurity, she immediately threw herself back into the political world with energy that would be remarkable in a person half her age. Richard made Eleanor his regent in England while he prepared to go on crusade. For the next several years, she effectively ran the kingdom, handling administration, justice, and diplomacy. When Richard was captured and held for ransom on his way back from the crusade, Eleanor personally organized the collection of the enormous ransom, traveling across England and Henry's continental domains, squeezing money from every possible source, determined to free her son. When Richard was released in 1194, Eleanor continued to serve as his most trusted advisor. She undertook diplomatic missions on his behalf, traveling to Spain to negotiate a marriage alliance, crossing the Pyrenees at age 77 in winter, a journey that would challenge travelers half her age. She mediated conflicts between Richard and his brother John. She worked tirelessly to protect the Angevin domains and secure the succession. Richard died in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound, and Eleanor, now nearly 80 years old, faced yet another crisis. Should the crown go to her youngest son John, or to Arthur, the teenage son of her dead son Geoffrey? Eleanor chose John, working to secure his succession despite knowing his weaknesses. She had little illusions about John's character. He was cruel, paranoid, and incompetent as a ruler, but he was her son, and perhaps she hoped she could guide him as she had guided Richard. Eleanor continued to be active in John's reign, undertaking diplomatic missions, mediating disputes, using all her experience and authority to try to hold together the Angevin domains. But she was finally reaching the limits of even her extraordinary energy. In 1202, at age 80, she retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she had long planned to end her days. She didn't simply wait for death even then. When her grandson Arthur was captured by John and subsequently disappeared, murdered on John's orders according to most accounts, Eleanor mourned but didn't break. When John's disastrous policies led to the loss of most of the Angevin continental territories, Eleanor watched the empire she'd helped build crumble, but she endured. She died at Fontevraud Abbey in March of 1204, at the age of 82, an extraordinary lifespan for the medieval period. She was buried in the Abbey church, beside her husband Henry, whom she had fought and defied, and her son Richard, whom she had loved and supported. Her effigy, carved in stone, shows her reading a book, a detail that tells us something about how she wished to be remembered, not just as a queen or a mother of kings, but as an educated, literate, intellectual woman. Eleanor's life spanned 82 years and reshaped European history. She was Queen of France for 15 years and Queen of England for 50 years, though 16 of those years were spent in imprisonment. She gave birth to 10 children, including 2 kings of England. She went on crusade when almost no other European woman of her status did. She was imprisoned for supporting her son's rebellion. She governed as regent multiple times. She outlived her first husband, her second husband, and 7 of her 10 children. The scandals that surrounded her, the rumors of affairs and plots, the accusations of manipulation and wickedness, largely reflect the discomfort of male chroniclers faced with a woman who refused to stay within traditional bounds. When she defied her first husband, when she chose her second husband, when she supported her sons against their father, when she governed kingdoms in her own right, she was doing things that powerful women weren't supposed to do. The chroniclers and later historians punished her for this transgression by surrounding her with legends of scandal and impropriety. But the truth of Eleanor's life is more impressive than any scandal. She was a political operator of extraordinary skill who understood power and how to use it. She was a devoted mother who supported her children, sometimes unwisely but always passionately. She was a patron of culture who supported poets and artists. She was a survivor who endured losses and setbacks that would have destroyed lesser people. She was, quite simply, one of the most remarkable women in European history, and her story deserves to be told and remembered not for the scandals but for the achievements, not for the legends but for the reality. Let yourself rest now with this image, Eleanor's stone effigy at Fontevraud, her hands holding an open book, her eyes closed in eternal repose. After all the kingdoms ruled, all the crusades and rebellions, all the imprisonments and triumphs, she rests finally at peace, secure in the knowledge that she lived a life without precedent, that she shaped the destiny of nations, that she refused to be constrained by what women were supposed to be and became instead fully, completely, remarkably herself. So here we are, dear traveler, at the end of our journey through 5,000 years and halfway around the world. We followed a plant from the steppes of Mongolia to the mountain fortresses of Persia, witnessing its transformation from practical fiber into sacred herb. We've met legendary emperors and fierce warriors, assassins and mystics, all connected by this simple green plant that could alter consciousness and open doors to other realms of being. We've walked through the marble halls of Renaissance Italy with Lucrezia Borgia, watching a woman born into infamy fight to define herself beyond the legends, to carve out space for agency and dignity in a world that wanted to reduce her to a scandalous footnote. We've seen how legends can obscure truth, how a woman's reputation can be destroyed by rumors and resurrected only centuries later by historians patient enough to look past the mythology to the complicated human being underneath. And we've traveled medieval Europe with Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most extraordinary woman of her age, watching her navigate 2 marriages, 2 kingdoms, 1 crusade, 1 imprisonment, and a lifetime of political intrigue with intelligence, determination, and sheer unbreakable will. We've seen how a woman could shape history even in an age that tried to confine women to narrowly defined roles. What threads connect these stories, you might wonder as you drift towards sleep. What patterns emerge from this complicated collection of plants and poisons, warriors and queens, legends and truths? Perhaps it's the theme of transformation. Cannabis transformed from plant to medicine to sacrament to scapegoat, its meaning changing with each culture that adopted it, each era that used it. Lucrezia transformed from Pope's daughter to duchess, from scandal to respectability, from legend to human being. Eleanor transformed from duchess to queen to prisoner to regent, constantly reinventing herself, constantly adapting to new circumstances. Or perhaps the common thread is the gap between legend and reality. The assassins who weren't hashish-crazed fanatics but disciplined religious warriors. Lucrezia, who wasn't a poisoner but a survivor. Eleanor, who wasn't merely scandalous but magnificently capable. In each case, the legend obscures as much as it reveals, telling us more about the fears and fantasies of later generations than about the actual historical reality. Or maybe the real connection is simply the stubborn human refusal to be defined by others. The Scythians creating their own sacred rituals in their felt tents, regardless of what Greek historians thought of them. The Nazaris building their mountain kingdom despite the opposition of empires. Lucrezia becoming a respected duchess despite being born a scandalous bastard. Eleanor governing kingdoms despite being imprisoned, despite being dismissed as merely decorative or dangerous. History is made by people who refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose on them. The plant that was supposed to be just fiber became medicine and sacrament. The women who were supposed to be pawns became queens. The warriors who were supposed to be barbarians created sophisticated cultures. The legends that were supposed to be simple turned out to be complicated. Nothing is ever as straightforward as it first appears. And perhaps that's the real lesson of tonight's journey, the truth you can take with you into your dreams. Life is more complicated than the stories we tell about it. People are more nuanced than the legends that grow up around them. History isn't a simple narrative of heroes and villains but a complicated interweaving of millions of individual choices, each person trying to survive, to thrive, to find meaning and purpose in their brief time on Earth. Cannabis wasn't good or evil, it was simply a plant, neutral in itself, made meaningful only by how humans chose to use it. Lucrezia wasn't purely innocent or purely guilty. She was a human being trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Eleanor wasn't a saint or a sinner. She was a woman using every tool at her disposal to live the fullest life possible. And you, dear listener, you too are more complicated than any simple story could capture. You contain multitudes. You are the inheritor of 5,000 years of human history, carrying within you the echoes of Scythian warriors and Chinese emperors, Renaissance courtiers and medieval queens. The same drives that motivated them, the desires for safety and meaning, for power and love, for transcendence and connection, these drives live in you as well. As you drift now toward sleep, let go of the need for simple stories. Let yourself be as complicated as you actually are. Let yourself contain contradictions, be sometimes strong and sometimes weak, sometimes brave and sometimes afraid. Let yourself be human, wonderfully and terribly human, just like every person we've met tonight, from the divine farmer tasting unknown plants to Eleanor reading her book in stone silence at Fontainebleau. The world is vast and old. Your life is brief and precious. The stories we've shared tonight are already ancient, already transformed into memory and dream. And yet they matter, these stories, because they remind us that humans have always struggled with the same questions, always sought the same comforts, always dreamed the same dreams. May your own dreams tonight be peaceful and deep. May you wake tomorrow refreshed, carrying with you some whisper of the stories we've shared. May you remember that you too are making history with every choice, every action, every moment of your existence. May you remember that legends grow from seeds of truth but take on lives of their own. May you remember to look past the surface of things to the complicated reality underneath. And if you've enjoyed this journey through time, this exploration of cannabis and queens, scandals and secrets, then I hope you'll take a moment to like this video, to subscribe to our channel, to share these stories with others who might appreciate them. Every story preserved is a small victory against the forgetting that time brings. Every story shared is a connection made across the barriers that separate us. Thank you for traveling with me tonight. Thank you for lending me your attention, your imagination, your willingness to drift across centuries and continents on the wings of words. Sleep well, dream deep, and know that tomorrow brings new stories, new journeys, new opportunities to be amazed by the strange, wonderful, complicated world we inhabit and the even stranger and more wonderful humans who populate it. Good night, traveler. May your sleep be sweet and your dreams be kind. Until we meet again in another story on another night, rest well. You've earned it.